Hi, and welcome to another episode of About the Authors TV. I'm your host, Jake Brown. When your name shows up in Encyclopedia Britannica, it's safe to say that you become a household name as an author. So woven into the fabric of the reading culture that you're likely to have your own sacred bookshelf in many homes, or in the case of the irreplaceable Joyce Carol Oates, perhaps an entire bookcase, with over 150 books and counting she's written in the past 60 plus years, encompassing a variety of historical settings and literary genres that began way back in 1963, just out of college, with the publication of her first short story collection by the North Gate, and then her full-length novel with Shuddering Fall the next year in 1964. Where she first demonstrated what the National Review observed was an uncanny ability to give us a cinemascopic version of her America. As the New Yorker would report in a cover profile, a high-achieving product of 1950s academia, she was the valedictorian of her graduating class in Syracuse University, and in 1960, Oates rejected what she saw as the prevailing pieties of literary conduct, motivating her bold move forward with her next novel, A Garden of Earthly Delights, winning the M.L. Rosenthal Award from the National Institute of Arts and Letters, and starting what many felt was a literary revolution with the arrival of her forever celebrated The Wonderland Quartet, which the New York Times in that moment crowned a superbly accomplished vision as it continued over the course of Expensive People, Them, which won the National Book Award for Fiction in 1970, and Wonderland in 1971. Following its release, Newsweek proclaimed her perhaps the most significant novelist to have emerged in the United States in the last decade. She continued to reshape the world of writing conventions and her own vision over the rest of the 1970s, with new best-selling novels like Do With Me What You Will in 1973, The Assassins in 1975, Childwold in 1976, Son of the Morning in 1978, Sybil and Unholy Loves in 1979, and Bellflower, equally lauded at the same time for her prolific fountain of short story collections that first began earning readers' reverie back in 1963 with the aforementioned By the North Gate, returning in 1966 with Upon the Sweeping Flood and Other Stories, before winning her first O. Henry Award in 1967 for In the Region of Ice, and being nominated for the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction in 1970 when The Wheel of Love and Other Stories was released. After winning her next O. Henry Award for The Dead in the early 1970s, Oates continued to be a marvel of muse over the rest of the decade with other short story collections like Marriages and Infidelities in 1972, The Goddess and Other Women in 1974, The Hungry Ghost, 7 Elusive Comedies in 1974, Where Are You Going, Where Have You Been, Stories of Young America, also published in 1974, two new collections the same year in 1975 with The Poison Kiss and Other Stories from the Portuguese and The Seduction and Other Stories, Crossing the Border in 1976, Nightside in 1977, All the Good People I've Left Behind in 1979, and A Seminal Education in 1980. Along with President Obama placing the National Humanities Medal around her neck at the White House in 2010, Professor Oates has been recognized, celebrated, and acknowledged with just about every other literary and arts award an author could dream of, with just a few highlights including winning the National Medal of Arts, the Jerusalem Award, the F. Scott Fitzgerald Award for Achievement in American Literature, or the Norman Mailer Prize for Lifetime Achievement, among many more over the galaxy of genres she's written across, from multiple Bram Stoker Awards to the World Fantasy Award, and of course the aforementioned National Book Prize, along with being nominated for the Pulitzer Prize 5 times. In a first for the show, she joins us today in part 1 of a 3-part career and catalog-spanning interview with one of America's true literary treasures. Professor Oates, we're absolutely speechless you're here. Thank you so much for the opportunity and for being with us. You've written often from and about your childhood, growing up in working-class Millsport, New York, throughout your storied career. How early do you first remember storytelling making a lasting impression on you? We understand Lewis Carroll was an important one.
Well, I think like a lot of children, I didn't really realize what I was reading. Of course, I read Alice in Wonderland and Alice Through the Looking Glass countless times since I've been a child. I've even taught it at Princeton University. And in some ways, it's not even a children's book. It's very sophisticated. But when I read it, I was only 8 years old, and I was really quite enchanted. There's a little girl, a heroine, and I was growing up on a small farm in upstate New York and didn't have very many playmates or friends or neighbors, and spent a lot of time just alone and with animals like cats and chickens. And so the book was like a portal into a true wonderland. My grandmother gave it to me when I was, I think, for my 8th birthday.
We're talking here, of course, about your treasure of a grandmother, Blanche, who opened up another door for your imagination to walk through when she gave you a typewriter for your 14th birthday. Please reminisce a bit, if you would, about how significant that gift was along your own path to discovering your way with words.
This is my Blanche Woodside. She was my beloved grandmother who turned out After she passed away, we learned that she was Jewish, and she had not told us. So my grandmother always had a special feeling for me. I was her first grandchild, so I think that was part of the reason. She gave me books for my birthday and for Christmas. At first, they were children's books that I sort of graduated to Nancy Drew, I think, and Black Stallion, and then onward from there to more serious things. She gave me my first typewriter. And so I sort of feel that I owe much of my writing life to the fact that my grandmother, who I think typically Jewish, really reviewed books.
Thank you, Grandma Blanche, because the world of literature would not be complete without you. As you continued reading into your teens, you've counted Charlotte Bronte, Emily Bronte, Fyodor Dostoevsky, William Faulkner, Ernest Hemingway, and David Henry Thoreau as influences, along with Edgar Allan Poe and H.G. Lovecraft. Any specific works you remember really being dazzled by that even perhaps they played a role in shaping your own style as a writer to come?
She loved going to the library, and she took me to the library in Lockport, New York. And she just sort of introduced me to the world of literature, which was not very well known in the farming area, the farming community. I don't think anyone read any books. I don't think there were any books. I would like to walk through the library in Lockport, New York. It's a beautiful, small library in that city. And I really fell in love with books, and even the smell of the library, just a kind of, to me, a very romantic atmosphere.
The Chicago Tribune would spotlight a signature established early within your catalog from your first novel forward, where you transformed the bleak rural area of Erie County, New York, where Oates grew up, into a mythic landscape where grim economic conditions and violent passions rule the lives of her bewildered, inarticulate people. Adding that because you did it so effectively, this earliest work heralded a commanding new voice in American fiction. Do you think, looking back on that early work now, you were trying to give them a voice and maybe speak up for them a little bit?
Yes. Well, as I said, I grew up on a small farm in Western New York, in an area that's north of Buffalo, it's known as the Snow Belt in Niagara County. And I went to a one-room schoolhouse. Eventually, I went to a city school in Lockport, and then eventually I went to Williamsville, which is a suburb of Buffalo, and quite affluent. So overall, I got a very good education. It didn't start off very promisingly, but it ended up quite good. Most of my writing, at least as early books, were really very highly charged with my memories of childhood and my parents' world and my grandparents' world, which is very rural and very rough. It was a kind of hard scrabble world that I was drawn to writing about.
Now, by the time you were attending Williamsville South High School, your promise was not just showing, but glowing, as you'd won your first Scholastic Art and Writing Award. And then by the time you were attending Syracuse University, studying for your BA in English, you won your first short story contest at 19, sponsored by Mademoiselle magazine. You spoke by the time you were in college already of going through something of a self-training regimen of writing and throwing out novel after novel. Was that the same process with short stories, or were there any from your college years while you were studying to receive your master's from the University of Wisconsin that wound up making it into your first published work, the O. Henry nominated by Northgate?
Well, it's hard to really know the quality of the work that I was doing because nobody read it except me. I don't really know what that would have been like. I do remember that I would write novels. I started when I was fairly young. I would write, like over a summer, I would write something on my manual typewriter that my grandmother gave me. I was under the spell for quite a while of the young Ernest Hemingway. I really emulated or tried to emulate the early stories from In Our Time. So some of those stories were eventually published like in a high school literary magazine. So I have read some of them, subsequently. And they do show that Hemingway influence. And soon then I became interested in Faulkner. And of course, Faulkner is the antithesis of Hemingway. So I was just kind of, I think, making my way in a very intuitive and uncritical thinking manner And I was doing a lot of reading just generally in the library. The book of short stories was accepted for publication, but then quite a while went by. I don't remember what was happening. But though it had been accepted when I was a certain age, it wasn't published until I was a little older. I mean, it may have been 2 years later. So, of course, I was thrilled and overwhelmed with excitement when I first got the news. I was a fairly young married woman. I mean, I had just been married a few months when my book was accepted. I called my husband at school where he was teaching, and I remember sort of stammering this news. I got this nice letter. But then I don't remember exactly whether I added more stories or what happened, but the book itself didn't get published until maybe a couple of years later. So when it finally came out, I was probably quite anxious at that point. I mean, I didn't know in a way whether it would be published. I think writers are always very insecure, especially young writers. A story might be accepted for publication and then the magazine might go bankrupt and collapse. Literary magazines sometimes would just disappear, or they would keep a story of mine for 8 or 10 months and then say they'd lost it. I think that was very typical of writers in those days. Now, today it may be differently, that people are submitting online and they may submit multiple times, but in the old days, we would send everything out by mail, and you were only supposed to submit one at a time.
While you were waiting for that book to be published, were you already at work writing your first novel, the genre shifting with Shuddering Falls, which the world fell in love with overnight? This included the career-killing or launching reviewers like the ones at the New York Times, who became an early fan way back in 1964, highlighting one of the excellent qualities of this novel by the talented young writer JOYCE Carol Oates as an unswerving fidelity to its theme. The theme is violence. All of this is recounted with an accomplished, accurate, careful prose. With Shuddering Falls succeeds in conveying a world where human beings are killers at heart, and where the tidal waves of desire and love which engulf them can't carry them to redemption, only to a becalmed acceptance of their natures. Miss Oates knows how to surround this hard tale with a hard atmosphere of sky, birds, wind, and conversation, as these hard people drive like stock cars, battered but charged with power at each other head on. Were the two main characters at the center of it all, Shar and Karen, based on any real-life muses?
Well, it's strange, but I've never really written much about my life after I left upstate New York. I mean, my college life and people that I knew subsequently don't really figure that much in my imagination. But certainly Shar and Karen are not from Syracuse University. That a completely different world, a totally different world.
You next dared your way into the groundbreaking and now fabled Wonderland Quartet, beginning with what America Magazine praised as a mystical cohesion that sowed its way into and through a garden of earthly delights. Did you initially envision this as a standalone novel, or know at the outset of writing that there'd be more books to follow?
I think I always begin with just one novel, then I might write another novel, and then a third novel, maybe I see a pattern, but certainly not. No, I really have to emphasize, if there are any young writers listening, most of us who have written a lot of books never really thought seriously that would be published at all. I mean, each story that I wrote, I would send out. If it got accepted, I was very grateful, but I didn't really definitely feel that this was a career. Each story was sort of like a standalone, and then my books. I had no sense that there would be another book, let alone subsequent books. No, that's what's strange about life. We truly don't know what's in store for us, and that's both good. It's both good and bad, I suppose. We have no idea. A lot of anxiety for many writers maybe have been lessened if they or we could have known that we would have a career, and that it would be on a kind of plateau, and that you might write a book every year or so, write your stories on a kind of regular cycle, like several stories a year, and that they could be published. If somehow we would know that that was a possibility, I think the early years wouldn't be so anxious.
Well, whatever plateau or new terrain or elevation of the genre that you were traveling on already by then with characters like Clara Walpole or Carleton or Lowry or Reverie or Swan, interestingly introduced in 4 parts focused on each in the first book, or a narrator, Richard Everett from Expensive People. How well do you feel like you get to know these characters as they're first coming to life as vividly on the page for you as they then do for us as readers?
I sort of feel that I know the people. I do a lot of walking and running. I like to run every day. And I think and just sort of meditate. And the characters are more or less in my imagination, I think. They might be composites, and there's a good deal of myself in them. So Richard Everett of Expensive People is partly a phenomenon of the voice of the novel. I wanted a very idiomatic, conversational voice, a candid, confessional, ironic, somewhat funny voice. I didn't want a formal voice or anything elevated. And I was looking for a sort of dark comedy. And it's almost as if the voice just sort of created itself, and this character comes with the voice.
You take home your first National Book Award after 2 back-to-back nominations for the first 2 books in the Wonderland Quartet by the time we arrive at the 3rd in the series, The Forever Iconic Them, which inspired the nation to note that when Miss Oates' potent, life-gripping imagination could join, as they are preeminently in them, she is a prodigious writer. You once commented that this novel almost wrote itself, but boy do the lead characters, Loretta Botsford, Maureen Wendell, and Jules, go through some tough times along the way, especially Maureen living in Detroit. And the New Yorker would importantly recognize in its review that, as you wrote, Oates has deployed her zeal for revision to forge a style of rousing roughness. She taps her feeling of inner chaos as a creative resource. If the phrase woman of letters existed, Joyce Carol Oates would be foremost in this country entitled to it. What from your own experiences living in Detroit while teaching at the city's university and meeting so many characters from so many different cultures and circumstances that wove its way through the fabric of this novel and the personalities that we get to know within its pages?
Well, living in Detroit gave me a different perspective. I had only lived in somewhat rural communities or small towns like Madison, Wisconsin. And I'd been at college, but I had never really been in a large city. So when my husband, Ray Smith, and I came to live in Detroit, in the early 1960s, we rented an apartment near the center, not the center city, but the center residential city, which is out around 7 Mile Road. So there's a residential area of quite nice homes, and we rented a small apartment near Palmer Park, which is a nice area. And then the subsequent year or so, we bought a house. Then a few years later, we bought another house. So we're sort of getting very, very settled in that area. And to me, that was a revelation. I never lived in a large city before. So reading the city newspaper and hearing about the racial difficulties of the 60s and the just general malaise of American culture at that time, as the 60s deepened and the agitation about the Vietnam War became more and more inescapable. My students were caught up in the whole frenzy of the anti-Vietnam War movement. So it was quite a surprise to go to that kind of intense, heavily populated world in contrast to living in the country or just being like in a college town. I think there are degrees of difficulty of writing. Sometimes writing is very difficult and one does a lot of revision of each page. I think because them was from the point of view of the 2 young characters primarily, and Loretta, the mother. Maureen and Jules were just people whom I felt I knew. So I guess writing about them and writing their thoughts, kind of 3rd-person narrative, was not that difficult.
Time magazine would recognize you ahead of the release of this final book in the series as that rarity in American fiction, a writer who seems to grow with each new book. And as she arrived at the self-titled conclusion to the quartet with Wonderland, please give viewers a brief look at what you so fascinatingly termed the phantasmagoria personality at play within the pages of this forever remarkable work.
I became interested in psychology and later neuroscience, and reading about the lives of psychologists and research neuroscientists. So the phantasmagoria of personality is really just an acknowledgement that our personalities and our brains are just quite mysterious, and that nobody really understands where personality comes from or what consciousness is, this little sort of spark of like a little flame that enlivens us. I don't think that neuroscientists really understand even now.
With Jessie Vogel's character journey specifically, why did it feel right to you to set the book's story arc over the Great Depression through the 1960s?
Well, I love writing novels that takes place over a period of time because obviously one grows with the characters. And writing a novel is a process. It's not, you don't have a product so much as you have a process that you keep working on day after day. So the characters are kind of growing with you. And whatever conception you have at the outset, it soon gets deeper and more complicated. And so it's like going on a travel adventure with someone.
Taking stock of the sheer influence the Wonderland Quartet had not only on pop culture, but a new generation of female writers, who through your new voice of style and writing were first finding their own. Always vocal early champion, the New York Times gave a rounder full circle assessment, beginning with their high compliment that A Garden of Earthly Delight speaks with an almost perfect felicity in a variety of voices and is incidentally bizarre. Expensive People is witty, precisely calculated, and bizarre, and she carried away the National Book Award in 1970. She deserved it. Them is legitimately what the blurb writers call powerful, predicting at the conclusion to their review of Wonderland that Miss Oates at 32 is very much alive and we should expect more brilliant work from her. And indeed, following your first decade dominating the 1960s as one of its by far most exciting and thought-provoking authors, Newsweek would declare you to be perhaps the most significant novelist to have emerged in the United States in the last decade. And that reputation was solidified over the rest of the 1970s with a second run of gallery pieces that all were unique works of art, with Do With Me What You Will in 1973, and then The Assassins in 1975. Within this very riveting mystery, you reflected what National Public Radio has argued are dark themes you shine a spotlight on often, that of domestic violence, rape, and suicide. These are the themes that Oates returns to again and again in her work. In the working class world of upstate New York, she says this was as much a part of the landscape as apple orchards. She is drawn to writing about people who had to get through life without that protection. How do you respond to those kinds of characterizations of your work?
Well, I do tend to feel, along with Balzac and maybe the great writers of tragedy, that a crime of some kind of transgression, lies at the beginning of the story. That something has happened to throw things out of joint. As Shakespeare would say, the time is out of joint, and I have been chosen to make it right. And so often my writing does begin with a crime. It may begin with a literal crime, like a murder. Like Wonderland begins with a slaughter of a family by what we now call the family annihilator. But when I wrote that novel, that term didn't exist, where a father takes a gun and just kills his whole family. But sparing one boy is spared accidentally, and he tells a story. And it's like the novel becomes his story.
Your Idea Factory continued delivering fans new bestsellers throughout the rest of the decade, including Childwold in 1976, and the triumph of the Spider Monkey novella the same year, The Sun in the Morning in 1978, and Sybil in Unholy Loves in 1979, dazzling critics like another longtime cheerleader, the LA Times, to proclaim that Joyce Carol Oates is a phenomenon of productivity, while taking equally impressive note of the way they felt you time and again created an astonishing fever dream of a novel. Does it ever feel like that for you as you're writing away?
I think the only way to really talk about the intensity of working on a novel is you think about a dream that you had last night. Say every night we have a succession of dreams. I don't know how many. We could have 20 dreams, or you could have 5, or I don't know, you could have 100 dreams. I mean, a lot of flitting things. But once in a while you have a profound dream that leaves you quite shaken. And really, you open your eyes and you're just exhausted. The dream is just so powerful. When a novel can be like that, it can have that kind of intense psychic feeling that is very difficult to explain to another person. though you know that something's happened to you. Maybe it's like being struck by lightning, like a current of electricity goes through you. And it's a profound experience, but you can't communicate it very well.
Equally lauded for your fountain of short story collections that first began earning reader reverie back in 1963 with the publication of the aforementioned By the North Gate, which you followed up abundantly over the next 2 decades with award-winning collections, including Upon the Sweeping Flood and Other Stories in 1966, before winning your first O. Henry Award in 1967 for In the Region of Ice, writing Where Are You Going, Where Have You Been, which we understand was inspired by Bob Dylan's It's All Over Now, Baby Blue, and loosely based on the serial killer Charles Schmidt. The Wheel of Love and Other Stories earned you your first Pulitzer Prize for Fiction nomination in 1970, and then in 1973 you won your second O. Henry Prize for The Dead, continuing thereafter to publish prolifically through the rest of the decade with Marriages and Infidelities in 1972, The Goddess and Other Women in 1974, The Hungary Ghost, 7 Elusive Comedies in 1974. Where Are You Going, Where Have You Been? Stories of Young America in 1974. The Poisoned Kiss and Other Stories from the Portuguese in 1975, along with a second collection, The Seduction and Other Stories. Crossing the Border in 1976. Nightside in 1977. All the Good People I've Left Behind in 1979, and A Seminal Education in 1980. Writer Magazine has reported of your muse in the past that while crafting her vast collections of short stories, Oates gathers inspiration from real events, either her personal experiences or those she calls from the headlines. These ideas seep and evolve through her subconscious imagination, ultimately taking on a new form that reflects the present moment. Regardless of how her creativity transforms the stories, they are always based in reality. With as much intensity as you invest in writing them, do you find that you become attached, say, more to a short story than a novel once you're done?
Writing a short story is more like going for a short run. It's a sprint. Well, I've written so many short stories. I tend to really love the stories when I write them. There are some stories that later on I don't like as much, so I don't put them in the hardcover books. So I have large stacks in the other room, not in the room that we're in right now, but in another room. I have large stacks of stories that have been published in magazines, but when it came down to it and I reread them and thought about them, I didn't put them in a book. So they're just kind of wandering, the equivalent of being in limbo. They're not in hell, they're not in heaven, they're just kind of in this limbo space.
Amidst everything else that you had going on in your writing career during this superstar second decade, you took out time to help young authors in the pages of the Ontario Review, your very own literary magazine co-founded with your late husband Raymond J. Smith in 1974, and which notably ran successfully in print over the next 35 years until 2008, eventually growing into a full-fledged publishing house. What brought you the greatest joy of working day in and out side by side with him, inspiring new generations of writing minds?
I just like working with young writers. I tend to identify with young writers. I enjoy reading their work, and it's fun to teach them how to edit their own work.
Within the same realm, and I apologize in advance as I'm sure you've been asked this for decades on end, but after such experience responding, what do you feel at the heart of it all is the greatest piece of sage wisdom you share with those audiences that you chair here?
Oh, don't be discouraged. I think that's probably the most profound advice. It's sort of minimal. It's minimal advice. Don't be discouraged.
In closing, would that include recommending to writers aspiring or veteran work exercise like walking or your long-loved pastime of running into their routine before beginning or even during that day's work?
I think most writers walk. I think Charles Dickens would walk like 20 miles a day. Sir Walter Scott, William Wordsworth, Coleridge, Byron, Shelley, all these, even Henry James walked a lot. It's just something that most writers just walk a lot, I think, and think. And I try to run a little. I don't run as much as I used to, but I try to run every day. And it just opens up the mind. And I see like a kind of a kaleidoscope, like a scene, like something that's very visual. And it's important not to have anybody with you so that you can be very quiet.
Professor Oates, it has been truly captivating listening to you today talk about your incredible one-of-a-kind career and catalog. Thank you so much for taking time to be on About the Authors TV.
Thank you so much, Jake.
And please stay tuned for parts 2 and 3 in the near future of our career-spanning interview with Dr. Joyce Carol Oates.